Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to our workshop this evening on evaluation report writing. We have two evaluators with us tonight, Elizabeth and Mary Ann. They are from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, are going to be talking to us about some do's and don'ts of evaluation report writing. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll let you just, give a couple of minute introductions of yourselves, and we'll go from there. But thanks very much for taking the time.
Sure, of course. We're both excited to be here. So my name's Ann Aabye. I'm a monitoring and evaluation specialist at ECA at the State Department. I've been with the Bureau for about 4 years. I've written reports. I've received reports from contractors. I've also been on the outside of government and written reports for the government. So happy to share some of what I've learned throughout that process with all of you today.
Great, and hi, I'm Elizabeth Botkin. I'm also a monitoring and evaluation specialist with Mary Ann at ECA. I've been there for about 2 years. Before that, though, I worked for about 2 years at an external evaluation firm and did a lot of external evaluations for various government agencies, including ECA and State Department.
Yeah, so we'll just go ahead and jump right in. Starting with, we wanted to tell you a little bit about ECA's evaluation division, which is where we both work. So we have 4 major lines of effort, starting with the evaluation work that we do. So this is deep dive projects into various ECA exchange programs. They'll take anywhere from maybe only a few months if they're a shorter term project to maybe a couple years, depending on the scope. They're usually mixed method projects, looking at using surveys, interviews, focus groups, a range of different methodologies, covering usually a few different countries, so they're international in scope. A lot of our recent ones have also dealt with American participants or American stakeholders. We also do performance monitoring, so helping with the more ongoing data needs of the Bureau, including creating the Bureau's new monitoring data for ECA framework. So the new results framework for the Bureau to kind of consolidate all the performance monitoring needs that the Bureau needs. We do capacity building, so helping our program office colleagues and the Bureau's implementers build their monitoring and evaluation capacity, trying to get everyone sort of on the same page for kind of the basics, so that we all have a baseline for understanding each other. And then learning, that institutional learning. So we don't just do evaluations, we don't just hand over data. We really make sure that all of the data we're collecting, all of the work we're doing feeds into program improvement, that we're really helping people understand what the data means and how it can help them make even better programs. That's a really, really quick overview. We do a lot of stuff. We put out a lot of really great products, and you can find all of that on our website, including all of our completed evaluations. All of our evaluation reports go on the website. We'll reference a few of them today or this evening, so you can go on our website and find all of them at the link below. All right, so that's a really, really quick introduction to where Elizabeth and I both work and what we do. But let's talk about writing successful evaluation reports. We're going to talk about specific do's and don'ts and tips that we have. But when we were thinking about this topic, we realized that we really have 3 kind of overarching, we have 3 overarching pieces of, 3 overarching recommendations for you, things that we think are really core to making sure that the reports you write are relevant and are useful and are going to be documents that get used by the clients you're working with. And the first is to communicate early and often with your client. Elizabeth and I will both mention this many, many times throughout this presentation, but you want to make sure you're in constant communication with your client, that you're starting early, that everyone's on the same page about the purpose of the evaluation, that you all know that you know what your client wants to get out of it, what your role is supposed to be. And then ask your client what they actually want from a report. What page, how long do they want it to be? What's the audience supposed to be? What kind of visuals do they want? What sections do they want to see in a report? Do they want recommendations? Do they not want recommendations? This is really key, because if you don't know what they want, then you can't deliver it. And once you know what your clients want from a report, strive to deliver that. Now, I'm not telling you to tell your client what they want to hear. That's a very different thing. But try to meet what they're asking for in terms of how you structure your report. And then lastly, understand the audience and write for that group. If your client tells you that the audience for the report is going to be non-technical, don't write a report that's filled with technical language and lots of jargon. It's not going to resonate with the people who end up reading it. Every time I've seen something go wrong with an evaluation report, it's been because one of these something went wrong in these three things. Either communication wasn't happening, someone didn't deliver what we wanted from the report, or they just didn't write to the audience we needed them to. So these are kind of like the 5 main sections we usually look for in an evaluation report. And we're going to talk through each one individually and kind of talk a little bit about what it is, what is the section, what we're looking for, and some tips and tricks, some recommendations we have for doing each one well. Starting with, I'm going to kick it over to Elizabeth to talk about executive summaries.
Thanks, Marianne. So executive summaries, your little mini report at the beginning of your report. You really want to use this section to summarize your report for readers that have limited time. So you want, if someone doesn't have time to read the full report, you want them to get a basic understanding of your evaluation and findings from this executive summary. This is one of the first places we're going to recommend that you talk with your client and see what they want from the executive summary. One of the first questions that we would recommend that you ask them is who the target audience for the executive summary is. Sometimes the target audience for the executive summary is different than your overall report. We've definitely had experiences where the overall report is really meant to be for program implementers and people that want to get into the nitty-gritty, but they want the executive summary to be for leadership or Congress or people that aren't going to read a full report, but they want them to understand the findings from the evaluation. Another question that you want to ask is, should the executive summary stand alone? So we've had cases or requests where our clients want us to develop an executive summary that's more of an introduction to the overall report. They feel that whoever reads the report is going to read the whole thing, and they want the executive summary to kind of lead into it. We have other people that have wanted the executive summary to stand apart. Someone should be able to read the executive summary and leave with the top level understandings of the evaluation, and that's all they will need to read. Some general pointers, or just common practice in executive summaries, is to have it follow the report outline. So make sure that it has the same sections as your report and has the same top level information. You also want to make sure that you check your data from your executive summary and make sure that it matches your full report. I know that one seems kind of common sense, but I've definitely done this myself and seen other people do it where something gets updated in the main body of the report and the executive summary doesn't get updated. And then lastly, in your executive summary, since most of the times it's pretty short, normally between 2, 5, maybe 10 pages, you don't normally have a lot of space for a lot of data visualization. So most of your data is going to wind up in the narrative body of your executive summary. one thing I wanted to say too about the following the report outline and making sure your data matches the full report. One of the things that we do at ECA to make sure that there's no issues with this is we actually write our executive summary last. So even though it's normally the first part of the report, we leave it blank until we've almost finalized the entire report, and then we write the executive summary. So then that way there's less likely to be discrepancies. And then we wanted to give you an example of an executive summary. So this was an evaluation that we contracted with an external evaluation firm for the ECA program, Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation. And they had developed an executive summary that it was 9 pages, so a little long, but it was meant to be a standalone document. So someone would be able to read this executive summary and understand the evaluation. Now, the next section we're going to talk about is the context. And there's 3 main components that go into the context area of the report. The first 2 are the background and the evaluation overview. From these sections, you want to make sure that the reader has everything that they need to know to understand the report. So in the background, you want to focus on the program or intervention that's the focus of the evaluation. So the history of the program, who the participants were, how far back the program goes, what activities are the primary activities, and also who are the stakeholders in the program. So is it going to be just the implementing partners? Is it going to be program staff at your organization? Is it going to be funders? Make sure that's what explained in that background. This would also be the area where you want to include any political, regional, or situational information that might affect either the program itself or the evaluation. And that leads into the evaluation overview. This is where you want to make sure the reader understands, why did you do an evaluation in the first place? Was it requested? Is it mandated? How did this evaluation come about? And how will the evaluation findings be used? And part of that, one thing that you can use to help explain that is the evaluation questions. So this is something that you will talk to your client about when you're scoping out the evaluation, and it should have guided your evaluation. And so making sure that the reader understands what questions you were trying to answer, and subsequently, what questions are you going to be answering in the report. So that's good to include in this section as well. And then lastly, if your client has a standing monitoring system, this is also where you would want to tie in how the evaluation connects to that monitoring system. So mentioning any theories of change or monitoring objectives for the program or intervention, the evaluation overview is a great place to include that. And then the last component of methodology, or the last component of context, is the methodology. Gets its own slide because as evaluators, we love methodology, but sometimes our readers don't love it as much as we do. So some general rules that we follow for our methodology sections is some things you want to include is the sample size of your evaluation. So how many people did you talk to? What type of people did you talk to? As well as the data collection strategies you use. So is it a survey, interview, focus groups? Make sure that the reader understands that. Give an overview of your analysis. And when you're giving this overview of the analysis, you want to make sure that you're steering away from jargon and you're not getting too technical unless it was requested by your client. And keep it higher level to where your reader knows what they need to know, but it's not inundating them with too much information. However, you can also include, we're going to talk about appendices later on, but one thing that you can include in your appendices is if you do want to go into a more detailed methodology, or you want to make sure that information's in the report somewhere for a more technical reader, you can always include that in the appendix. And on the flip side, some things not to include, you don't want to go into complex method details or analytic models or math. I've personally received reports where in the methodology section, there's complex regression model equations and large tables and charts with different statistical significance about different sample sizes. A lot of that is best to include in the appendix if you think it's important to have in the report somewhere, and not in the main methodology section in the body of the report.
All right, so the next section is the big one. It's the finding section. This is where you're telling your client, your reader, everything you learned throughout the whole entire evaluation process. And it's a section where you have all of your data. You have all your information. So let's talk about qualitative data first. The first piece of advice we have is to lean on all the coding you're going to do with your qualitative data. So you're going to go through the process of coding interviews or focus group transcripts. That take those codes and really use them in your report. You can use them in visualizations. It's how you're going to make qualitative information quantitative, right? How you can say, a specific number of people who got something out of a training or learned something during an exchange program, even if it's not something you asked in a survey or something along those lines. And you can take those codes and then you can visualize them. So a lot of times people ask, well, how do I visualize qualitative information? You do it through the coding that you've done. You can also use qualitative data to complement any quantitative data that you've collected. It's really great. Qualitative information is wonderful for providing additional examples or even giving more context around survey data, for example. So in a survey, you might have information about why someone wasn't able to act on a skill that they learned during a program. And your interviews can provide some additional examples about what was stopping them or just context about why they weren't able to use those skills. And with your quantitative data, keep it simple. Keep the jargon to a minimum. And if you have to use jargon, find a way to explain what you're saying. Your visuals should be clear and to the point. Any data visualization you use should try to say one thing as clearly as possible. And then also try to learn, you need to know when to visualize something versus when to just summarize data and maybe point someone to a larger data table that's in an appendix. The data visualization is great. It's wonderful. I personally love it. Sometimes data is not worth visualizing, and it's just easier to put a summary of it in your report and move on from it. And also remember, you do not have to use all of the data that you collect. And I know that can feel really, really grating. I know I don't like the concept. I put in the work to get this information. Obviously, it all needs to go into the report. But not everything is going to be relevant to the evaluation questions. Not all of it. Not all of the data you collect will directly answer a question or will have a really important finding that you need to talk about. It's okay to leave things out. It's also okay to not talk about something in the body of your report and just stick it in an appendix. So,
Mary, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
We've got some questions that have come through on this. Sure. One is with regard to design. So where would you discuss your evaluation design? Do you put that into your methodology, or is that something that you put someplace else?
So that would go into your methodology. So your methodology is where you're going to talk about, your methodology is where you talk about what you did. It's where you talk about the data collection methods you used, and anything else along those lines.
And then it looks like you might be addressing it, but there's some questions around how to visualize qualitative data and if you should be using exact quotes from interviews, perhaps, as part of your the qualitative data that you show?
Sure. So I'll get into this a little bit, but in terms of visualizing qualitative data, you can, my personal philosophy on this is that you can visualize qualitative data just the same as you can quantitative data. You have codes that are, once you have gone through the process of coding your interviews or your focus group transcripts or whatever it is you then essentially have quantitative data that can be visualized just the same as survey data. So you can take those codes and you can put them, you can take, the numbers you have from those codes and you can put them into bar graphs or line charts. Probably don't make a lot of sense, but there are a lot of different things. It kind of, once you start thinking about it that way, it opens up the world of, there are lots of different things that you can do with it. And we'll talk about data visualization a little bit, but I'm also going to point you to as part of the capacity building we do in the Bureau, we did a webinar on data visualization that I'll point you to, that will hopefully be, we're not going to dive into data visualization tonight, but I'll point you towards that, which will hopefully help a little bit. And then in terms of quotes, you can absolutely quote people directly. You just have to think really carefully about how you attribute quotes. If you've promised anonymity, you obviously can't use names. And so you have to be careful about how much information you use to identify what the quote is. We will usually say, participant from X country. If country is too specific, we might say participant from X region. And I'll show you an example in a minute of what that might look like. All right. So one way to make a report sort of stand out and really resonate with people is to not just talk about your data, but to try to actually tell a little bit of a story with the information you have. And it's not so much a formula, but one way we have found to do that is to kind of find, whatever data point it is you want to talk about, introduce it a little bit, insert whatever visualization it is you have on that data point, add a little bit more context, and then provide an example. So what this all might look like. This is from a recent evaluation report that Elizabeth and I helped co-author. So the data we wanted to talk about was how cultural experiences from the exchange helped participants get a better understanding of the United States. Then we have the visual talking about the survey data. This happened to be from survey data. We could have visualized this through coding from qualitative information as well. So I've introduced my data point and then I've given you the visual of it. We then go in, we add a little bit more context of all of this, which is to follow up and say, participants also noted that Americans had a willingness to really help others. I go on to say a little bit more about that. And then I have an example. I have a quote from one of our participants. And you'll note that we had promised everyone who spoke with us anonymity, but we tell you that this participant was from Zimbabwe. We give you the specific project they were on, and we tell you that they were a coach. This particular program had youth participants and they had coaches as well. So we give you a little bit of identifying information, but not enough that you could figure out specifically who it was. And if you want to go in and find the report, I've given you the link to the report. I mentioned a couple slides ago that sometimes you're better off not visualizing your data and just providing a summary and moving on. This is an example of that. So this is a visual that we were provided in an early draft of a report we received. Only the most intrepid reader is going to attempt to figure out what this says. It was ultimately scrapped from the report. It's far too complicated to attempt to understand. So this is a case where it is you are absolutely better off summarizing the information, just summarizing the main point, and maybe putting this in an appendix, or just putting an even simpler data table in an appendix that you direct people to. And as I mentioned a little while ago, if you want to hear a little bit more about data visualization, there's a link at the bottom of this slide to a webinar that we did last summer on data visualization. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Great. So getting into the conclusions and recommendations. These sections are where you help the reader make sense of everything you've presented in the findings, and then also make recommendations based off of those findings and conclusions. So starting with the conclusion section, hey, Marianne, can you click this slide forward? Thank you. So starting with the conclusion section, this section should answer the evaluation questions that you presented at the beginning of the report. So this should be where you take the findings and you connect those back to the evaluation questions. I think it can be really easy when you put data out there to assume that it speaks for itself and that everybody's going to draw the same conclusions from that data, but that's not always the case. So the conclusion section really gives you the opportunity to make sure that you bring the reader back to the same page and make sure they're taking away what you want them to from the findings. You also have the recommendation section. So this is where you get into how are you supposed to use the findings and conclusions. Sometimes it's not always clear after you cover those first two areas what your client should do with that. For a lot of our reports, we pull recommendations from two main places. One is from our data collection. So a lot of times the people that we talk to during our data collection efforts have recommendations about our programs or interventions and changes that they would like to see. Most of the time, if those changes are those requested changes are supported by our findings from the evaluation, we'll include those recommendations in our report. And then also as the evaluator and the person that has collected all this data and done the analysis, we also use the evaluators as another source of recommendations to take those conclusions and synthesize them into actionable items. So these two sections sometimes get the rap for being the bad news sections. This is where a lot of times the reader may say like, oh, these are all the problems with the program or the intervention. But really, a lot of times in your report, and especially with your work with a client, you can frame the conclusions and the recommendations as learning opportunities. We actually were just on a training earlier today, and I liked what the trainer did, because he was like, hey, if anybody has a perfect program out there, let me know, like email me, because I'd love to hear about it. And so kind of framing things in that way of like almost all programs or interventions are going to have room for improvement really helps prepare your client and readers for what's going to come in his conclusion and recommendation sections. Also creating, making sure from the beginning, knowing if your client wants a utilization focused evaluation. So what are their intentions with this evaluation? Are they just looking for data to take to their funders and show here's all the great things we're doing? Or are they looking to have implementation or process improvement, or show that or see if they're achieving the outcomes that they think they're achieving? And then one tool that we use in ECA to kind of help frame this culture of learning and including our program officers and our user groups in the development of the conclusions and recommendations is most of the time before we finalize the report, so before that last final draft, we will have a final report briefing with our primary requesters of the report and of the evaluation. And we'll go over at that time in a session, the findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So that way we can get their feedback. And there have been a lot of times that we'll be in those sessions, and even there, the people that are participating start brainstorming how they'd like to use the data, or they'll ask questions. So that way, when they get that final report, nothing's really coming to them as a surprise. And a lot of times, some of the stuff they see in there in the recommendation section even came from some of their brainstorming. And then I'm going to turn it back to Mary Ann. I keep trying to skip appendices, sorry.
So we've mentioned putting things into appendices a number of times. So now we're going to talk about appendices for just a minute. All right. Appendices are a versatile and sometimes underutilized tool that can help you out a lot if you're facing a really strict page limit, or when you're trying, or just in making sure that you're writing to your audience. So if you've been asked to make sure that your report isn't technical, that it's for a lay audience, it's really easily understood, but you did some really technical things. Maybe you did a really technical regression analysis, and you want to make sure that all of your fancy regression analysis gets put somewhere. Your appendices are the perfect place for that. You can put all of your analysis, you can put all of that analysis into an appendix, because someone somewhere out there is going to want to read that, is going to want to see it. But if your report needs to be 20 pages and needs to be easily understood for a really broad audience, you can't put those in the report. You need to summarize all of that information. And the content you put into an appendix should be relevant to the report, but isn't directly necessary for the reader's comprehension. So if you take it out of the report and remove it, your report should still be completely understandable. All right, so some content you can consider putting into an appendix, and a lot of these we've already mentioned, but additional program background, maybe there are some really complicated political factors going on that you want to talk about, but you don't have space to go into a lot of detail on. Additional information about your methodology or just your evaluation design. Your data collection instruments. We do this with almost all of our evaluations. We provide the survey or the interview guides so that people can see the questions we were using to get the data that we're talking about in our findings sections. It also allows people to use those questions in the future, and we can continue the research, the body of research that exists. And then again, full data sets of analysis. We've talked about this quite a bit. So one example I want to leave you with is an evaluation of the International Writing Program. You can see the report itself was only 17 pages. And part of how we were able to do that is one of our appendices was a detailed program background. The program's fairly complicated. It has lots of different components. And so we talked about those in depth in an appendix. The evaluation methodology, all of the charts and numbers, the breakdowns of who we were talking to and in what region, all of that got stuck in an appendix. We also had the evaluation statement of work. A lot of this work got done internally, but we had some assistance from an outside firm. So we put the statement of work in an appendix so a reader could see exactly precisely what they were helping us with and what they weren't helping us with. And as I mentioned, our data collection instruments. So you yourself could go evaluate a writing exchange program. If you wanted to, you could use the data collection instruments we had.
Okay, great. So who has ever received a report back with the comment column that looks like this? So one of the things we wanted to make sure we talked about was kind of that interpersonal aspect of report writing. And this is actually an example from back when I worked as an external evaluator, and I was actually conducting an evaluation and writing a report for Mary Ann. And you might ask yourself, Elizabeth, why are you and Mary Ann still such great colleagues and friends, even though she put, 4 comments on 1 page? Does she not like my writing? Does she think I'm a horrible writer? But one thing that's important to keep in mind when you're writing a report is that it's a very iterative process. So you're going to go through a lot of drafts and receive a lot of feedback where you send the report to your client, you get feedback, and you edit and revise 1, 2, 3, 4 times. A lot of times the feedback, although sometimes you can get a lot and it can seem overwhelming at first, it really helps make the report stronger, and it helps to make sure that your client is getting something that really resonates with them and resonates with their audience. I think something we've learned is as the evaluators, you become very, very familiar with the program. But sometimes when you're working with your client, they're the ones that know how how historically the program has been communicated and ways to phrase certain things. So that leads me to my last interpersonal aspect component, and that is to kind of balance the integrity and rigor of your report with client requests. So a lot of times when we're going through the drafts of our reports, a client might ask us to revise a finding or ask a question about a conclusion, and sometimes they might ask to change the wording. So when you're making those types of revisions to the report, it's kind of balancing, changing wording to make sure that it resonates with the client and with readers, but it also still accurately reflects what you learned during the evaluation and doesn't compromise those the data that you collected and the findings you found. And I think that was our last slide. Yep. And so at this point, we just figured we could take questions for the remaining of the time.
There's a couple of questions in the chat that I can ask, and then maybe people can unmute themselves if they have put up their hands and they have additional questions. One is, do you put the theory of change or the log frame in the report? And if so, where?
So we actually have not historically done that. We just started that process of including it. I would recommend, it depends probably on how long the theory of change or log frame are. It might be good to summarize it in a place like the evaluation overview. And then if it's a really in-depth document, you could always include that in an appendix so someone can go and look at all of the details. And I think it would also depend on how much you're basing your evaluation on that theory of change in log frame and how much you're measuring against it, would probably be something I would consider on whether I include more or less in the main body of the report.
Yeah, I would just add that I think whenever you're making a decision about should I include something, should I not include something, it's to just think about how relevant is it to the report, and is it going to help someone understand is it going to help someone understand the findings, the conclusions I got to, and the recommendations I'm making. And so if you think that having the theory of change is going to help someone understand the program or the intervention that you've been working on, then you should definitely consider putting it in. And again, as Elizabeth mentioned, where you put it in is definitely, it's up to you. And I think it partially has, I think a really important consideration there is for people who are going to read it, how well do they already know the program? If they already know the program really well, then you might want to consider, again, as Elizabeth said, summarize it and stick the actual document in an appendix so people can refer back to it if they want to.
There's a question in the chat about adding the SOW to the appendix. In what cases, what factors would determine when you add the SOW to the appendix or not?
So we don't do it in every case, but we've definitely we'll do it in cases where there's been sort of a division of labor. So we've had a lot of recent projects where, let me back up for a second. A lot of our evaluations are just completely externally contracted. We hand them over to someone, we hand them over to an outside firm and they do all the work. Much more recently, we've been doing more hybrid projects where they're mostly being taken on by the evaluation division. So folks on our staff, but we'll bring a firm on to do a piece of the project. So they might help us do interviews for a specific group because we need to interview 40 people in 2 months, and that's not something we have the staff capacity to do. I think in those cases, adding the SOW to the evaluation is really helpful to just kind of explain what specifically the division of labor is, because we can tell someone in the methodology, this was mostly done by the evaluation division, but we had some help from this outside firm and they did this and we did this. But if you put that statement of work in the back, someone can, again, someone who's curious and wants to see can go back there and can look and can see like, oh, okay, this is specifically what that firm did versus this is what this other group did. But again, I have also seen evaluations where, you know, firms who do work for their government just put their statement of work in there, again, partially so that they can explain like this was the specific scope of what we were working on. I don't know if there are really like, there really aren't cut and dry, this is when you do it, this is when you don't do it.
So just a couple of more comments. Susan says that USAID is now requiring, it's supposed to be, the SOW is supposed to be attached to the evaluation. And then there's a question around the SOW, if it has the timeline and the cost, would you remove those details or just put the whole SOW into the appendix?
We have always left timeline information in. We've never moved any of that information out. Our SOWs don't have cost information in them. So we've never dealt with that. If it does, that might be something you could, you can make that decision for, if you're internal for the government working on this, you can kind of determine what you want your policy to be. If you're outside and you're sticking it in, you could talk to whoever your client is. If you're not comfortable having it in, you could probably negotiate having it removed. I will say we're really transparent about how much our evaluation costs, about how much how much we spend on each of our evaluations. So we put out learning documents after all of our evaluations, just sort of summarizing what happened, what the findings were, and how all of the findings and recommendations were used. And part of the summary information includes how much we spent on the evaluation. So even if our SOWs included the cost, we would still publish it, just to be transparent about how much we're spending.
So I can continue to ask questions, or we can have people come in and ask them themselves. Rose, I think you have a question. Do you want me to ask it for you? Okay. We were looking at learning and using results or findings to facilitate learning, to facilitate change management and policy. Can you discuss some of these processes, some of the best practices and pitfalls of that learning piece that you introduced us to at the very beginning of your presentation?
Yeah, I feel like learning could be its own session for sure.
Maybe we should do one.
Yeah. So I think that so I think your role in learning depends some based on if you're an internal evaluator or an external evaluator. So I can tell you a little bit about our processes as an internal evaluation team, because we have a little more ability to help with organizational learning. It gets a little trickier if you're an external evaluator. But one thing we do is we make sure from the beginning that our client, who we call our user group, they're normally our program officers who want to know information about their programs. We make sure they know from the beginning that our goal is to give them data and findings and recommendations that they can use moving forward. And we've also set up, Marianne just actually mentioned some case studies we do. So we've set up a whole process after an evaluation to help our user groups then transition using the final report and from the evaluation into an action plan. So we have an action planning conversation that takes the recommendations and helps our program teams basically determine, based on the recommendations, what actions can they take? Are there adjustments to their program they can make or in their processes? And then who's the responsible party? What's the expected timeline for that change? And then we actually follow up with them after they've had time to implement some of those changes, and we develop a case study. We call them Evaluation Matters. And that's what Marianne was just talking about, where we include the findings, the recommendations from the evaluation, but also how our program teams were able to use that information, along with some of the other data Marianne already mentioned.
Because there's a lot of emphasis on monitoring, evaluation, and learning in USAID programs. In fact, every other activity that is coming out in that area has a learning component with not only managing what they call mailman platforms, but also change management within the USAID missions, and sometimes with the local partners, the local IPs that work for USAID.
Yeah, and we're really starting to put a huge emphasis on learning from evaluation, learning onto our evaluations and within that process. And I think something that's been really important is building in the expectation of learning right at the beginning of an evaluation process. So we go into an evaluation saying that part of what you will get out of this are recommendations, and we expect to help you figure out how to implement those. And if we get a program team that comes to us and it's just like, no, I don't think that's not what we want from this process, then we would think very carefully about whether or not we actually work with them, because we're working very hard to build that culture of learning within the Bureau. Our projects are always very utilization focused. We no longer write reports that just sit on shelves. If that happened, we don't want to see that happen. We don't want to spend our time writing those reports. We want to provide things that are useful, that help the Bureau grow.
Okay. And so the CLA methodology, the collaboration, learning, and adapting, not many professionals, and this is for Beverly as well. I don't know how we can look at that and start building a cadre of people who do that. Because I think from now we're just kind of pulling from organizational development, we're pulling from other areas. But that's an area that we could look at. Okay. Thank you.
I think your volume is your voice is cutting out there a little bit, but I think the point is around the learning piece, which there was another question that came through on that as well. How does your organization put in place a learning feedback that is easily accessible to those who need to access it? So maybe that relates back to some of the things that Rose was saying, that how can you put this into action? How can you realize the learning and the change that we need to realize?
I think we've shared the main learning initiatives that we've taken so far. I think it's definitely an area that we're still growing as an evaluation team and as an organization. So we're definitely still out there seeing what best practices are too. I know that some of the things we've explored is putting things like our case studies out there for information. We've had conversations around maybe bringing on a learning and innovation officer, where that's their primary role, is to take this information both on our monitoring side and our evaluation side, and help our organization better use that. But yeah, it's definitely something that we're still growing at, and still learning ourselves.
One of the things you mentioned is about putting your research instruments at the end of a report. And for me, that's one of the things that I use most often from other reports. If I have to do interviews on something, I'll pull up other reports from the State Department or USAID or others, and just go through the appendix and say, well, what questions did they ask? How did they ask them? What were some of the methodology pitfalls that came as under as this evaluation was being conducted? Susan has a couple of questions. Do you want to ask those questions?
Sure, I can. This is in the context of the evaluation that I'm doing, and I came across my evaluation questions are really very narrow, and so I came across some information. One of the questions is on CLA during COVID times and what the impact of COVID has been on CLA, and I came across information on the broader MEL plan that was actually outside the scope of what the evaluation question is, but they basically, what I ended up doing is providing a separate memo, gave it to the mission, and as a USAID evaluation, gave it to the mission and for their use. But it's not like I'm trying to figure out, do I include that in the evaluation report? The way I dealt with it was very limited in the evaluation. I just said, you got some issues here that you should look at, but then I gave very specific recommendations to the mission. How do you handle when you come across information that isn't really pertinent exactly to the evaluation questions, but they're pretty important that you should address them? You shouldn't just ignore them, or you feel like you shouldn't ignore them. What do? You don't ignore them, or do you?
I think that this is part of where sort of early and regular communication can really come into play. If you start to realize that you're coming across information that could be really important, might be really relevant, could be something that your client might want to act on, but it's not directly relevant. It's not directly part of a question you're asking. If you have that regular communication with them, that's a really great way to then to bring it up and just say, this is something we're hearing and we don't know what to do with it. What do you want us to do with it? Is it okay if we fold it into the report? Do you want a separate memo of some sort on it? Is it okay if we maybe write a 2-pager and we stick it in an appendix because it's something that we heard that we thought was really interesting? I think but having that, if you have that relationship, I think just having that conversation and bringing it up and saying, we don't want you to miss out on this information. What do we do? Because if you feel like it's really important, even if it's not directly relevant, I would never want to just let it go.
Yeah, I think especially if some of your recommendations are based off of that information. So I know one of the first things I do when I'm looking at the recommendations, I compare it back to, is it supported by the findings or information that's there? So I think that if some of your recommendations are based off of that information, you'd want to make sure it's at least mentioned or cited. Maybe if you don't go into as much depth as you would want to. But we've also had we've had some projects where something like that comes up and it's not really tied to the evaluation questions, but it's something that would be important to the program. And we'll make a little 1 or 2 page appendix that goes alongside the report. That way the information is not lost, but the report still covers the main evaluation questions.
Thanks.
Nilofar has a couple of questions. Do you want me to ask them, or do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I can ask them. So my questions are, the first one is, apart from the technicality of the reports, in your experience, have you or do you ever get feedback on your reports and how much of the information or recommendations have been taken into account and have improved their programs or the programs the organization will have in the future? That's the first one.
I'm sorry, I got distracted by the chat box. Can you repeat the question? I'm so sorry.
Absolutely. So, apart from the technicality of the reports, which is the main part of this workshop, my question is, in your experience, have you or do you ever get feedback on your reports, and how much of the information recommendations have been taken into account by the client, and how much of that have improved their programs or the programs that the organization will have in the future?
Yeah, I'd say we definitely get a lot of feedback on our reports. We just the structure of our bureau is very we have our program officers, and then we have a lot of other interested parties and leadership that all wind up reviewing our report. So we normally go through several rounds of feedback from different stakeholders. And a lot of times, a lot of the feedback we get is asking to ask if the data would support diving deeper, or maybe getting a little more nuanced. I think the request we get all the time is there will be a data point, and inevitably someone will say, like, can you break this down by country or by region or by age group, or a demographic that we hadn't planned for, and we have to tell them, no, we can't. So we definitely go through a lot of that process. But in terms of using the report afterwards, I think going through that process and being accommodating of the feedback actually helps our users want to use the report more, because at that point they're invested in it. They've read this 30 or 40 page of report like multiple times, and they're familiar with it and excited to start implementing those things. And then I think since we have some structure in place to help guide them in that process, it also helps facilitate it. So we have, honestly, our action plan document is as simple as an Excel spreadsheet that they can just put their recommendations in, and then their plan moving forward. And that's actually helped. I think we implemented that a year and a half ago now or so. And and we've had about 3 or 4 programs that have been able to take recommendations and make actionable changes in their program with it. I think an area that we definitely still need to grow in is a lot of our programs overlap in certain areas. And I think one thing that we are still figuring out how to facilitate is if we learn something in one evaluation, but it was something that's applicable to other programs, how do we get that information out there so other programs can also make that change? And that's something that we're still grappling with.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And my second question is that has any client ever asked for a change in your report in terms of the information sections, formats? They're like, like this is too much, I only need this, or, can you make it simpler, or it's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All the time.
Inevitably.
Yeah. It's so, and I think that's part of why we build our review process, or we have gotten to the review process we have, so that, so the way ours works is our evaluation firm will send the report directly to the evaluation division, and we'll read it through. At that point, we have been working with this program team for a year or more, and we kind of have we generally feel like we have a handle on what they're looking for and what they want. And then it goes to the program team. And at that point, inevitably, there is a section that they don't like, or they want to move things around, or there are pieces of information that are too complicated or too dense. That first round of review is always the point where I almost always feel really bad sending the report back to the firm, because I feel like we're just telling them that everything they've done is just absolutely terrible, when it's not. It's just that when you have these organizations that all they do every day is write evaluation reports, and they know this information, they know it's so in depth, and they want to tell you everything that they did, and then it goes to people who don't have the same experience with monitoring and evaluation. There's going to be there's going to be a mismatch there. And it takes a minute to get everybody on the same page. And we try our hardest to make sure that doesn't happen, between being very clear about expectations for the report, which we've gotten a lot better at over the past couple of years, trying to have interim briefings so that people can hear the findings, they can talk about what they want. But it doesn't always work. And inevitably someone will say that they want to move things around, that something's not working, they want to change how something's framed.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I recently just finished an evaluation that towards the end, it was like our third or fourth draft, and the team and the user group decided that they didn't want to call them host organizations. They wanted to call them host institutions. And so we had to go through the whole report and change them all. So little things like that even.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I think Fiona has a question, and then Catherine.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up, and you might have already addressed it, so I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time on it, but I was asking just generally what the typical length of a report is, because I'm pretty new to this. So curious how you balance brevity with providing enough context, because I have a lot of trouble getting people to read really long documents. So if I were to send someone a 20-page report, they definitely wouldn't read it. But I'm also not sure if that's the standard.
Elizabeth, do you remember what our current page length requirement is?
I think 30 to 40 pages, or we might have no more than 35 pages.
Something like
one
that.
of those two.
Yeah. Yeah. So we require something in the 30-ish, or we try to keep them something in that range. 25 to 30 pages. Thank you, Natalie. But the balance is really hard, and it takes the page limit never includes appendices, by the way. So when we talk about a page limit, we're talking about the actual body of your report. So it's excluding your executive summary, and it's excluding your appendices. So it's excluding all that stuff at the front and the beginning, and it's just talking about the actual body of your report. And yeah, balancing how to keep that page limit, but also providing all the context you need, and summarizing all the findings is really hard. But I think that's part of why utilize your appendices. Remember that you do not have to talk about every single data point that you collected. And so really take a look at what is most relevant to answer the evaluation questions. And when you're looking at sort of all the upfront stuff, what is most relevant because I think that's the section that really gets people, is they'll spend 10 to 15 pages talking about program background and their methodology and the purpose of the evaluation, and then they have 20 pages left. And they're like, oh no, what is most relevant that someone needs to understand, and try to do it in as few pages as possible.
Yeah, it also sounds like using an executive summary as a standalone document might be a good option for you as well. So if you know people aren't going to read even 20 pages, let alone 30 pages, having an executive summary that can stand alone and at least get the high level message out there might be a good option as well.
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of executive summaries that can completely stand alone. They're really, really great for pushing around to leadership. We talk a lot, sometimes we have program officers who are like, I would really like to potentially be able to send this to Congress. We all know that Congress is not going to want to read a 25-page report. Shorter the better. Even, the example we showed you that's 9 pages would probably be way too long. But an executive summary that can stand alone. Once you've written your report, executive summary that can fully stand alone is a very, is a fantastic tool to have.
I think we have Catherine and then Danuta.
Hello. Yeah, so my question is about that process of getting feedback on your evaluation report from the organization that you're working with. When I started the most recent evaluation that I'm working on, I did not have those conversations in the beginning about expectations around the report, which is a really great note for the future. But since the report that I'm sending them, it's not necessarily going to be published on like the Department of State's like list of evaluations. There's no kind of specific external place that this is going to be published. Do you make sure to seek that feedback from the organization about the report pretty much every time, or like if it's just getting sent to like a leadership team, is it okay to just like, here's what I found from the evaluation and kind of send it off to them for them to digest, and then they can ask questions? And
I'd say as a general rule, I can't think of a time that I didn't send a report for feedback. I think you can, a situation where I could see not sending it for feedback would be maybe if you've been in very close connection with the organization and they already know everything that's going to be in the report. Maybe then you wouldn't expect too much feedback. But generally, honestly, yeah, even when I've kept organizations or our user groups informed of the evaluation and the findings, they still have feedback on the report. So,
and I would say part of the reason I find that useful is because for as much as we then feel like we know about the program, it's really helpful to have the program expert weigh in on what we're saying and help us make sure we're putting things in the right context. And whenever they do that, always try to, Elizabeth was saying this during our presentation, but we'll always try to recognize that they're not saying anything of what they're saying to try to get us to change our findings. That's never anyone's goal, but sometimes findings need to be put in the right context. Or sometimes we're just incorrect in something we're saying about a program. And even if it's really informal, before it goes to leadership, just running it by someone who knows the program really well to say, could you give this a quick read to make sure I've got all my facts straight? It's just a really helpful step to take.
great, thank you.
Danuta, I think you're up next.
Both Mary Ann and Elizabeth, I appreciate it. And my question is actually more on the practical side. What, if any, editing and or proofreading do you benefit from or don't use in your report writing? It sometimes getting too close to the topic and the written word, especially at that kind of length, you know what you're saying. This is what I tell some people I know. You know what you're saying, but sometimes someone on the outside, once they read it, it's not exactly getting through. So, do you use any other forms of editing, or swap pieces of the report with colleagues or whatnot?
Sure. So, two things. When we're writing, so especially when we're writing, if it's a more internal report, if we're writing it, so especially the report we just wrote that Elizabeth and I helped co-author, we're basically swapping it back and forth between each other, and having each other be able to read each other's sections was really helpful, because we could go back and forth and say, I think I know what you were trying to say, but it definitely doesn't make any sense. But I think that's also part of why the review process is really helpful, because again, you get really close to it, and having your client, that program office, read it and then be able to push back on you and say parts of this just aren't making sense. It's just really helpful, not just in the review process, but as an editing process. We also require all of our reports to go through a copy editing process, which is really helpful.
No, that makes total sense. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, we also have our fearless leader, Natalie, who I think some of you have met in the past, who also reads everything as a final set of eyes. So that way, if we get in trouble later, we can just say that she approved it. So.
Well, I thought it was funny when you put the text up there with all the comments on the side. And I was thinking that my students are looking at this and they're thinking, that's exactly what she does to our papers. Because you read it and you say, yeah, that doesn't make sense. And, I think you meant it this way, or this evidence isn't adding up. It's maybe part of being an evaluator is you're always looking at every sentence and saying, yeah, that just doesn't fit together. Talatha, I think you had something, and then I think Amal had something in the chat. So maybe Talatha and then Amal.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that one of the challenges of doing evaluation by yourself is that you don't have that feedback, right? You don't have somebody who's saying, did you really mean to say this, or this is not clear enough. My question has to do with stakeholder feedback. So the organization I'm working with wants me to actually do a presentation of the findings to their stakeholders. And I was wondering about whether or not the comments and the concerns that may come up, or just added information that may come up from the stakeholders, like where do you put that kind of information? Do you put that in the appendix? Is that a separate document? Particularly if the report is not finalized, do you go back and make change? I mean, what happens with that? What do you do with that?
Yeah, I think it can depend on how significant the feedback is. Sometimes I think what comes up a lot of times in our stakeholder presentations is they might ask us to dig deeper into some of the findings, like they might ask for more information. I think that's probably the most common thing that comes up in our stakeholder conversations. And with that, it really just comes down to either the data supports it or it doesn't. So you kind of have to look at the data you've collected and be able to tell them, we didn't anticipate that question. It wasn't part of the original scope, so we don't really have any data to support that. Sometimes they might ask a question or ask you to dig a little deeper in something that you do have the data for and you just didn't include, and so you could add that into your findings or where it's appropriate in that way. The other thing that I think come up in our stakeholder conversations sometimes, like I mentioned, is and for us, a lot of times our stakeholders are implementing partners and our program officers. So they're people that are very familiar with the program, and they might start having ideas of like they might hear a finding and be like, oh, we should change this or this process. And so sometimes we'll even take that and put it in the recommendation section if it's something that, again, the findings support. But yeah, I think the biggest thing with stakeholder conversations is just going in and knowing, not being afraid to tell them, we didn't collect information on that, so we're not going to be able to include that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I guess, Marianne, actually, I just thought you had an instance once, though, where they wanted more information and didn't have it. So then they agreed to do a second contract and a second round of data collection to answer questions that they still have.
Oh, yeah.
So we've had that happen as well, where it leads to a phase 2 project.
Yeah. Fairly recently, actually, we were while we were in the process of finalizing the report, we realized our program team really wanted to know more about one specific piece of the findings that our contract firm just couldn't answer. They just didn't have enough information because of the way we had designed the evaluation, the way we'd done data collection, the questions we were asking. We just couldn't give it to them, but it was something they decided they really wanted to know. And so they got more work. We put together another contract, did another 9 months of work, and kind of got them the information. Turns out the question can't really be answered. Sometimes it happens. But So I think so again, these feedback sessions, these presentations can, when you're saying that wasn't part of how we were, that wasn't really a question we were answering, or the way we designed this evaluation, we couldn't answer that question, might lead to your client deciding that they want to do work on that specifically and lead to a new contract and more work. It has been known to happen.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I think Amal did have a question. I don't know if you want to pop on, or I can find it here in the chat.
Yes, thank you. I can say that. I hope it doesn't take much time. But in summary, we went through the technicality of writing reports. But from a professional point of view, when you read a report, what do you look at in a report to determine, well, this report is credible, or this evaluator is a credible one. He knows what he's doing. Mm-hmm. So what do you look at? Because we learn there are so many ways of doing evaluation. There are so many methods, so many ways of collecting information. But what do you look at in a report? Say, okay, this person really knows what he's doing. I'm going to read his report or her report.
So I think that a good methodology section is one of the first things I look at in terms of credibility. So is it understandable? Can I follow what you did for the evaluation, whether that be the data collection methods or analytical methods, different evaluation methodologies you might have used, and also making sure that when you're talking about your evaluation plan, if you say you use a certain methodology, does the work that you've done support that? So did you conduct the interviews or focus groups that you needed to do whatever methodology you said you're going to do? So definitely making sure that matches up. Also, the other thing I look at is, when I'm looking through the findings and the conclusions, do they answer the evaluation questions? Does it give me the information that I was looking for? Those are the two big things for me that I kind of look for.
Thank you.
I would echo both of those. I would also add, is there a limitation section? No evaluation is perfect. And so do you own up to the fact that something didn't go right? There were limitations to your project, and do you tell me what they were? And the other thing on methods I would add is, do the methods make sense for what you were trying to do? So if you told me hopefully you told me what your questions were, did your methods make sense? So I think for me, a lot of, if I find a report credible, is a lot of it's in that first section. Like, did I find the setup to your evaluation credible? And if I do, then I'm much more likely to continue reading the report. And through the rest of it, it's, do you actually answer the questions you said you were going to? And if you do, great. If you don't, then I'm probably going to lose interest in the report.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we did go over by a few minutes, but I want to thank you, Mary Ann and Elizabeth and Natalie, who's on the line as well, for helping me arrange and for joining us tonight. It was super helpful for the students that are currently writing their course projects and their capstones, and for our alums that joined us who are in their evaluation careers and looking to write better reports. So thank you very much for taking the time. We really, really appreciate it.
It was great being here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Take care. Thank you.